The Russian offensive started at 5 a.m. on April 14th, when the greatest massing of artillery in military history, over 40,000 guns, opened up on our front. As reserve, we were behind the front line. We had a good view of the entire area, although we could see little more than where the action was taking place. We could see airplanes dropping bombs and artillery shells exploding, but very little more. Because of our combat experience, however, we could make an educated guess about what was happening. We could hear the roar of the battle, and we could see the depth of the battlefield and judge how well it could be defended. The massed artillery was awesome, and it was accompanied by increased air activity. The reports from the divisions fighting at the front indicated that the Russian offensive was being conducted with unimaginable force. The first day, our divisions in the front were able to stop them, even though there were some deep pockets in our line. As the reserve corps, we were on constant alert, awaiting orders to join the fight. The Russians continued attacking through the night and even intensified the attack at dawn. Their incessant artillery and aircraft bombardment was now beginning to devastate our positions. We knew we could not stop them in front of Silo, but we could see that Silo Heights presented us with a good fallback line of defense. Although we knew this was the decisive battle before Berlin, we also knew with a terrible sinking feeling that we could not hold them, although we wanted desperately to hold until the Western Allies reached Berlin so that the city would be spared occupation by Soviet forces. Once we had been committed, there would be no further reserves, and without reserves, the situation was hopeless. The Russians took 3 days to reach Silo, even with their vast superiority in men and artillery. They also had reconnaissance planes, which gave them an advantage that was not available to us. The hilly terrain on both sides of Silo, however, made the Russian advance more difficult. Finally, at 6 a.m. on April 16th, we became actively involved in the battle for Silo Heights by taking command of the divisions already fighting there, in addition to our own 2 divisions. From then on, we worked around the clock, catching an hour or 2 of sleep whenever conditions permitted. The next day, April 17th, brought new enemy attacks, and the Russians threw more and more tanks into the battle. The 9th Parachute Division destroyed 40 Russian tanks in one battle, and still the Russians kept coming, making constantly deeper incursions in our front. In some places, the Russians had already reached Silo Heights. A few Russian tanks broke through the defense line first, and then Russian infantry followed. A little gap had been opened, but the line was still holding to the right and to the left, so the Russians had to wait for reinforcements. During the wait, the defending German commander threw his reserve battalion into Silo and drove the Russians out again. Then the Russian reinforcements arrived, and they took the town again. Then our defending division threw in extra reserves and took it back. This seesawing back and forth continued for some time. The cold words on paper looked clinical and antiseptic, but with each change of hands, Russian and German soldiers were dying in agony and terror. The fierce German defense persisted, even though we were outnumbered 10-1, and our divisions were quickly becoming decimated. Every day we suffered more and more losses we could not make good, and finally the Russians began to break through. We were holding in the middle, but the Russians were streaming through on both sides and trying to get north and south of Berlin. When they reached our deep flanks, we had to fall back. Behind Silo Heights were some hills, and behind the hills were many lakes, so we decided to use the hills as our next line of defense. At 700 a.m. on April 18, 1945, heavy bombs fell close to our headquarters. The Russian attacks continued undiminished, and we began to have difficulty maintaining contact between the 3rd and 9th Armies. After 5 days of massive attacks, the 2nd Russian Armored Army succeeded in breaking through our front, threatening our left flank. Parts of the 18th Panzer Division began arriving, and in desperation, we threw them into the battle piecemeal as they arrived. With that, we managed to stop the Russians on our left. By 6 p.m., we could hear machine gun fire, and mortar shells were exploding nearby. Therefore, we moved our corps headquarters to a small community on a pine hill south of Strasbourg. Our single corps was now facing an entire Russian army group, which they called a front. Obviously, we were not going to be able to hold out here any better than anywhere else and would have to fall back to Berlin proper. Already, the Russians were shelling the city. The frontal attacks against us decreased during the day as the Russians now put everything available into exploiting the gaps on either side of our corps. The Hitler Youth Battalion that Weidling had been so reluctant to use had had its baptism of fire the night. Attacked by Russian tanks, the leader of the battalion, a 19-year-old senior Hitler Youth leader, had completely lost control at the very outset of combat. The crying of his wounded boys had deprived him of his nerve. Crying himself, he had ordered the position to be abandoned without making a report to the corps or to anyone else. In the afternoon, severe fighting developed about 3 kilometers north of our corps headquarters, between Russian tanks proceeding towards Strasbourg and our anti-aircraft emplacements. In spite of their courageous resistance and the destruction of many Russian tanks, the anti-aircraft crews could not stop the enemy in the long run, especially when infantry was dispatched against them. With that, facing the danger of being surrounded again, we ordered the front move back to the lake line in the Strasbourg area. Over country roads, dodging to the south since new enemy movements had been reported, I reached Peterschegen. The inhabitants had mostly left. Only a few elderly people were in some of the basements. I witnessed a truck loaded with bread and stopped because of traffic, being looted by passing women, children, and old men. The driver stood there, unable to do anything about it except make parrying gestures. His truck was emptied within a few minutes. The eastern Berlin suburbs were already under constant fire from light artillery, probably from the direction of Altlandsberg. For the remainder of the night, I could sleep on a bed for about 3 hours. I was awakened in the small hours of April 22nd, 1945, by the fire of light artillery and mortars in the surrounding area. I went to the air raid shelter of the Children's and Senior Citizens Institution next door, where our headquarters had been prepared in the meantime. 3 or 4 rooms had been emptied for us there. The other, larger rooms were occupied by 40 or 50 children and 15 to 20 nurses. Outside, it was becoming more and more dangerous because Russian tanks that had broken through and were driving around nearby. German tank hunter groups with like Panzerfaust were chasing them, and the tanks were shooting wildly in all directions. All divisions reported new Russian attacks with tank support. I could hear the sounds of infantry fighting coming closer and closer. The fight was obviously hopeless, and we could not understand why the government did not sue for peace and stop the senseless slaughter. Slogans and propaganda were not going to throw the Soviets out of Germany. At the most optimistic, we could continue to resist a couple more weeks. We had not during the entire war had the kind of firepower the Russians were now unleashing against us on one small front, and what was happening to our troops was inhuman. They were now fighting with little more than determination, desperation, and raw courage. In the west, the Western Allies were at the Elbe River, with a few small bridgeheads on the east side of the river, but they had stopped there without carrying out an attack farther to the east. This had stunned us because we had fought so fiercely against the Russians in the hope that we could hold them off until the Western forces arrived to take Berlin. Now it seemed obvious that they had no interest in taking Berlin to keep the Russians out. The end had to come with the encirclement of Berlin by the Russians. To stay meant Russian captivity or death. If we escaped to the west, it would mean freedom, or in the worst case British or American captivity, which was not too disturbing. But it also meant abandoning those men who were still fighting so desperately, and neither of us could bear the thought of deserting such brave men. We decided to stay and do our duty to the end. There was no question that, with the red stripes on our trousers and the corps flag on my car, we would have made it through all the roadblocks and controls. No one in our respective staffs would have questioned our disappearance. They would have assumed that we had not been able to get away from our old headquarters and had been killed or captured. But our pride and sense of duty would not let us do it.